Good morning to all of you, and welcome all of you to this panel on leveraging policies for sustainable development goals. The Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs as we call it, represent a global policy roadmap through 2030. They were endorsed by 193 countries to achieve a world free of poverty, a world free of that is fair, and a world that is respect the limits of nature. The SDG represent the right response to the great challenges in our time. The clock is ticking on the SDG agenda. Yes, we have seen great progress in reducing poverty over the last few decades, but almost 800 million people still live in extreme poverty around the world. The world has never been more prosperous, but growth is not being shared widely enough, and we have nowhere near the ambition needed to tackle climate change and other environmental hazards. At the same time, the global economic environment is becoming more challenging, and rising debt complicates effort to devote more budgetary resources to SDG priorities. The bottom line is that achieving the SDGs will require substantial additional spending, especially in low-income developing countries. We at the IMF recently estimate the spending needs in 5 key SDGs sectors, which include education, health, road, electricity, and water and sanitation. Our main findings is that the low-income developing countries needed to raise annual spending by 14 percentage points of GDP on average. When we added up across a group of 49 low-income developing countries, the amount actually comes to $500 billion a year. The figures, it looks big. Indeed, it is very big, but it amounts to less than half a percentage point of global GDPs. So if all of us move together, and we can achieve our goals. So as a first priority, low-income developing countries themselves must be in the driver's seat. They need to make a concerted effort to enhance tax capacities and raise spending efficiencies. Of course, it's not easy, but this is the task has to be undertaken. But let's be honest, this alone will not be enough. Achieving SDGs requires a strong global partnership that support from all stakeholders, including the private sectors, donors, international organizations, and philanthropists as well. So the IMF will continue to play its part to support the SDGs, which is aligned with our core mandate. We will continue to support our memberships in strengthening revenue mobilizations, investment spending efficiencies, public debt management, and financial inclusions. So we'll also enhance our financial support for low-income developing countries as well. So today, we have a very impressive panel comprising some of the world's leading advocates, leading voices for sustainable development. They will be talking about the policies and partnerships to achieve the SDGs. All of us, including myself, are very much look forward to the panel's discussions of these important topics. So let me conclude by quoting what Nelson Mandela once said. He said, "Action without vision is only passing time. Vision without actions is merely daydreaming. But vision with actions can change the entire world." Thank you very much, and thank you. And let me give the floor to Rochelle, please.
A big thank you to IMF Deputy Managing Director Tao Zhang for his opening remarks for this session. My name is Rochelle Akufo. I'm the business news anchor for CGTN America, that's China Global Television Network, and I'll be moderating today's esteemed panel on an engaging discussion on leveraging policies on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And as you know, that's the ambitious global framework based on the idea that development should be economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. So we'll explore what's needed to galvanize support from the global community, raise visibility, and of course, mobilize that support action, as we just heard there. So let's start by welcoming our panelists. We have Jeffrey Sachs here, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. We also have Winnie Byanyima, Executive Director of Oxfam International. And Balai Begashaw, Director General of the Sustainable Development Goals Center for Africa. And of course, Masood Ahmed, President of the Center for Global Development. Welcome. Now, this, of course, is a global effort and it's a global discussion. So I encourage all of you here, and of course, all of you streaming online, to use the hashtag SDGs, that's SDGs, to share your insights, your ideas, and of course, any questions that you might have for our panel. And so we encourage that across all your social media platforms. I know Indonesia is top when it comes to that, so I expect everyone to do their part. Now, rather than having introductory remarks, we're going to get right into our discussions and let our panelists really share their key messages through some lively dialogue. So, Mr. Zhang was kind enough to lay out the funding needs for SDGs in 5 key areas: education, health, water and sanitation, roads and electricity. So now let's break down how countries pay for these SDGs. So, Jeffrey, please start us off.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the IMF for this panel and for its excellent work on the Sustainable Development Goals. It's really very important leadership for the international system. The SDGs are a universal agenda, meaning that there are important investment needs in all countries of the world, because the SDGs are about moving to more socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable objectives. For the rich countries, the reform of the energy sector is fundamental. For some rich countries like my own, the United States, more social protection and greater equality is essential. For poor countries, meeting the basic economic needs of health, education, decent nutrition, basic infrastructure are surely the highest priorities. So the first part of any SDG analysis is, what are we talking about? Which countries? What challenges specifically? Because it's a broad agenda. As a basic point, I would start with the following. For countries above a certain income level, and the IMF puts that breakpoint at roughly $3,000 per capita, the resource needs to meet the SDGs are largely within the reach of those countries themselves, whether by budgetary means or by market finance. For countries below that threshold of roughly $3,000 per capita, it is the case that when you look closely at the needs, the domestic resource base is not sufficient to achieve those goals. The poorer the country, the bigger the challenge. It's also important to keep in mind that certain parts of the SDGs will be covered by private sector investment, but a significant part requires budgetary outlays. So this becomes a fiscal issue, and that's why the IMF's role is so important as the central fiscal institution in the world. So for the countries below $3,000 per capita, you can make an even stronger point, and that is that the budgets cannot manage the public outlays that are required to achieve the SDGs. What kind of public outlays? Three kinds. Public services like health and education, capital expenditures like infrastructure, and social protection, often of desperately poor people who need social protection to stay alive. Those three items are budgetary outlays. When you analyze closely the budgets of poor countries, a poor country may be able to mobilize 20 or 25% of its gross domestic product in revenues of various kinds, tax and other. But when you look at the spending needs to achieve the SDGs in low-income countries, it can easily reach 40 to 50% of GDP, because healthcare is not free, education is not free, water and sanitation is not free. The conclusion is that if you leave poor countries on their own, they will fail to achieve the SDGs. That may sound like a shrug of the shoulders, so what? But in this case, failing to meet the SDGs means life and death. It means children dying of poverty, of which more than 5 million a year currently do. It means hundreds of millions of kids not in school, as is currently the case, not able to find a place in a classroom because the budget is not adequate to provide even the most rudimentary education system. The IMF has done wonderful analysis for this group of what the IMF calls the low-income developing countries. 59 countries, generally below roughly $3,000 per capita. These are the countries eligible for IMF concessional financing. They require more than $500 billion per year increased spending now, per year, to achieve the SDGs. But where is that funding going to come from? Domestic revenues could cover a part of it, especially if the rich countries were to crack down on the tax havens that make it very difficult to collect money from multinational companies right now, because there's so much gimmickry that the tax havens suck up the money that should be paid in income tax.
Now, Jeffrey, I do want to
I'll just finish one point.
Sure.
That leaves a remaining gap, though, and that is where global development assistance remains central. And we hear all the time, and this is my last point of this intervention, I'll make others, but this is my last point. Development aid is not passé. Even though there are trillions of dollars in capital markets, they're not going to finance health and education and basic sanitation and other basic needs of poor people. It is a lie and a misunderstanding to think that they will. And I say it's a lie because there's a lot of big propaganda about the private capital markets now. If you want to help poor people, you give them services to stay alive as their human rights, as we have said for 50 years but failed to do. Development aid is crucial to close that gap. My country, the United States, which is a nasty country at the government level, nasty, believe me, nasty, is spending 30 times more on the military than it is on development aid. And it's called a civilized country, which it is not, at least not our federal government. It's not civilized. And finally,
Jeffrey.
One more point, sorry. I got to get to one more point.
All right,
we have
point.
2,208 billionaires right now, okay? They have $10 trillion of net worth. The money has flowed to the top. We need to tax them, and put the money to the SDG budgets of the low-income countries. Then the children can go to school. Mr. Bezos today has $160 billion of net worth. Mr. Bezos, you put a significant part of that to the SDGs, and we'll get the kids surviving and in school. You don't have to go to Mars right now, just go to the poor countries.
Now, Winnie, I'd like to bring you in here. Looking at these spending needs, what is your take on the main finding that low-income countries can't pay for this on their own? And also, Jeffrey raised the issue of tax avoidance and tax evasion and the role that plays. And we know that Oxfam recently co-authored a study. Tell us more about that. Connect those dots for us.
Thank you, Rochelle. And thank you, IMF, for inviting us here. More importantly, for doing this work on costing the Sustainable Development Goals. The question is about how would we pay for them? Well, let me begin by telling you about a woman from a low-income country whom I know, Maimuna, someone I grew up with from my village. This is a woman who's worked hard all her life. She's grown crops and sold them. She's sold fish. She's sold second-hand clothes. She's put her kids through schools. She's paid all her taxes. But she still is trapped in poverty. She's in her 60s. When she falls sick, she has to choose between buying food and buying medicine. The government can't pay for her kids to finish schooling. They had to drop out. So for me, paying for the Sustainable Development Goals, financing them, is about enabling women like Maimuna and millions like her in the low-income countries to rise from poverty. That's what it means for me. And so I'm going to mention three things. One is that to pay for the Sustainable Development Goals, the main form of revenues will be domestic revenues. It's so important that developing countries, low-income countries, can raise all the domestic revenues possible. You've just mentioned our commitment to reduce inequality index. We've launched this because we want to see and show visibly whether countries are doing everything possible to reduce inequality between the few at the top and the many at the bottom. They say they do, but we want to know whether they really do. So we are measuring how they tax, whether they are taxing progressively, passing the burden of taxation to the rich to pay their fair share and not to the poor. We check on their spending, whether they are spending enough on health, education, social protection, and we check on how they treat workers' rights, minimum wage. When we look at taxation, we see that so many countries are actually allowing the rich companies, rich individuals to get away without paying their fair share. They are relying more on indirect taxes, such as in Africa. 67% of the total revenues come from indirect taxes that burden poor people more, whereas the people at the top are getting away without paying their fair share. We find, for example, that in Brazil, the bottom 10% pay 32% of their income in tax, whereas the top 10% only pay 21% of their income. This kind of regressive taxation won't get us to pay for the SDGs. We want to see countries move towards getting the rich at the top to pay a tax on their top incomes, to tax their wealth, tax their inheritance. This is where the tax should go. And of course, Jeff is right that the whole corporate tax system is full of leakages, is full of holes. Companies are able to get away without paying where they make their profits. So closing the tax loopholes so that corporations can pay their fair share is one way of increasing the domestic revenues for countries such as the developing countries. Then, I also want to mention the harmful tax competition. The fact that big companies are able to go to poor countries and force them to lower and lower and lower the tax rate to a point where now, in some countries, it's almost like zero corporate tax rate. United States cut their tax rate recently. Europe has been at it for a very long time. The effect of that is that poor countries can't collect from these powerful companies what is their due. So leaving tax there, then we go to aid. Aid is another way for the low-income countries to survive and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We are seeing bad behavior of the rich countries who committed to pay 0.7%. They don't pay it, and the little they pay, increasingly, they purpose it away from fighting poverty and achieving the SDGs. Think about it. Aid was intended to fight poverty in the developing countries. What do we see now? Rich countries saying, we want to use it to support the refugees in our country. How is that going to help a developing country? They are saying, we want to use it to promote trade. How is that fighting poverty when you are giving it to your companies? So we're seeing bad behavior, aid being repurposed away from achieving the SDGs. Then the last one is foreign direct investment. Thank you, IMF, for this study that has shown the gap, the financing gap for the SDGs. And you have burst the myth that it will be the private sector who will close this gap. I have a problem with that. How can you say that selling education will lift girls and boys from poverty? The moment you start to charge, then it is the girls from poor families who lose out. Education has to be free. Health has to be free. You're not going to tell me that it's the private sector going to come and bring health and education in my country, Uganda. No way. It didn't happen in Europe. Why is it going to happen in Uganda? They have free health. They had free education. That's how they lifted their people from poverty. That's how we must also do it in our countries. It won't be companies that are going to give health and education to lift people from poverty. So foreign direct investment, yes, it will have its part, some parts of infrastructure and all that, but for the social spending, we do need governments to raise enough money to have the aid that can close the gap to provide the social spending that's needed.
Now, Belay, I'm going to bring you in here. What do you see as the more specific needs that are unique to Africa, and how are they being addressed?
Thank you. Let me echo and thank IMF actually for bringing this important issue as one of the most important agenda here. Definitely, I want to give some kind of context about Africa right now. Almost 44 countries are under that 3,000 per annum per capita capacity. As you know, the SDGs are, global agendas and targets are global, but the starting point is not the same. So Africa is starting from completely a disadvantageous situation, partly because the, GDP per capita and also, all kind of revenue, whether it's tax or other revenue, is not, something that could work actually to fund this kind of big visionary program. But also there are certain demographic issues that we have to take into context. And also there are clear, starting point, as I said, that poverty is in a worst form. Almost 47% of African population are below 1.9 dollar per day. And more importantly, prone and induced challenges that Africa is facing is having the worst form, either through flood or drought or hunger and all stuff. So we are in a very different situation when it comes to baseline. So how would we actually anticipate to meet these things when the situation is like this? I think this is a big issue right now. In the first place, these are countries who are normally struggling to meet a positive budget every year. And now we are asking them to upfront the investment and solve the problems that they have been struggling with since ever, within 15 years' time. So that's exactly what the call is. So in this situation, let alone actually solving this from the domestic resource, even when it comes to getting loans, almost 23 countries right now in Africa are not eligible for any kind of debt because their debt GDP ratio surpasses 55 plus. And under this situation, you are not eligible for any kind of debt. Secondly, the same amount of countries right now, they are to service their debt every year, and this takes actually 8 to 14% of the GDP. Every year, they have to pay that much money. And also, paying the premium is always an issue. And that takes about 26% of the export earning. So this is the situation. And we are trying to implement this very important program under this situation. So currently, all the calculations that we have done in costing the SDGs, it shows that Africa needs 400 to 500 billion incremental budget for meeting all those 5 areas that Jeff explained and IMF had studied. So when we talk about raising domestic resource, I think the only thing that we are talking here is about tax, okay? Tax is 13 to 15% of GDP right now. So we want to raise tax on the people who are actually paying tax right now, okay? Because the unemployment rate is alarming, and we can't bring in new investment because the investment situation doesn't seem like, very friendly for that kind of thing. So we want to put pressure on those taxpayers to pay more. Even if they pay more, they can't pay more than 5% because since 1990, for the last 25 years, actually, since, beginning of 1990, this figure raised 3 to 4%. Okay, it was close to 11%. Now it is in the range of 15%. So even if we raise that 5% the way it is predicted, but that 5% of GDP for low-income countries, in average, we are saying that it's like 700 billion, annual GDP. If you calculate it, it won't go more than actually, couple of hundreds. So we're not going to meet the situation this way. So what we're asking now is, yes, Africa is part of the global, arrangement, and we want to meet all the SDGs. However, there are certain SDGs that are extremely important because if we don't get them, we will not even trigger the economy. Education, health, energy, and water are, I think, the most baiting for us. And this requires, that amount of resource. So I think it is naive if we leave everything for the private sector to come and fill in. And instead, we have to put the maximum pressure on at least meeting the person agreement that the world had entered into 25 years back, which is meeting the 0.7% of GNI for OECD and developed countries. That figure easily goes to 280 billion per year. That, plus if we galvanize support from billionaires, maybe as Jeff said, which is not a small amount of money because it's 91 trillion actually the balance sheet shows 91 trillion, and 1% of that 91 trillion, as Jeff said, goes to about 91 billion. So those are the kind of things that we really need to bring into context if we think, and if we really, Africa has to be, part of the success story on SDGs. And also don't forget that when we talk about SDGs, out of these 169 targets and 17 goals, almost goal-wise, 56% of the goals are cross-border goals. And the rest are actually goals that have to be implemented within the geopolitical border. But when you see the targets, 39 targets, which is about 23% of the targets, are, in-country targets. So, in other words, what we are saying now is, first, you should not expect African countries to invest on such agendas like cross-border agendas, whether it's climate change or, life under ocean, or certain, those kind of agendas, when they still have huge and enormous problem in-house to solve, because this is the priority that they have. And if we don't actually get resources to them to solve their own problem, at least the resource that they should have allocated for on any kind of cross-border issues has to be taken care of by the international community in one way or another. So these are the issues that I just want to bring.
And so, Masood, Balai brings up a number of interesting points, especially these different baselines, these different starting points that countries have. So if you are leading a country and you have limited resources, and you're also trying to combat other things, you're fighting these increasingly devastating weather events, hunger, some very immediate pressing issues, how can you motivate countries to really prioritize SDGs in the face of these immediate pressures?
I think I'll come to your question in 1 minute, if I may, but I think, let me just say, first of all, that the reason why this is a really important seminar for the IMF to have is because it represents a bringing together of the conversation around progress towards the SDGs and the fiscal macro framework within which this has to be achieved. And I think it's progress because until recently, what you had were really two streams in which sort of fiscal macro work was being done without reference to the costing and financing of SDGs, and a lot of people working on SDGs without thinking about how this was going to be made feasible. So I think it's really important. And that's, in a way, also a lead-in to your question, which is countries, of course, are making these choices all the time. Today, they make these choices, very difficult choices. As Bele was saying, the worse off your starting point, the harder the trade-offs that you have to make. And I think what this framework enables you to do is to help you think through those trade-offs in the context of some common goals and aspirations that we have set for ourselves. So I think that's the way. I don't think of SDGs being in opposition to some immediate needs. And I think in a way, if you look at the SDGs, they are very immediate needs, right? I mean, it's not as if this is some luxury we're talking about. This is actually just a codification of the basic achievements and criteria that you would want any country to be able to move towards. We've set ourselves a target to get there. Now, I think the next thing I want to say, though, is there are some things that by now are agreed and clear. So, in a way, there's not much point in kind of discussing those internationally. So it's very clear, I think, everybody, that for low-income countries, the notion that they can finance this from some reallocation of domestic resources doesn't make sense. It's just not feasible. So let's not spend too much time trying to kind of force fit the problem into a preconceived solution there. I think I agree very much with the point that Jeff first made and others have picked up. Second, I think it's also very clear that if you look at where private financing is actually going in development, and if you look at where private financing is likely to go in development over the next decade, it's delusional for us to pretend that the costing and funding of SDGs will somehow be largely taken care of by the private sector. Some of it will be. I mean, as it happens, a third of the schools in poor countries are actually private schools today, right? So in some ways, some of it will happen, but by and large, SDG financing is for health, for education, for basic sanitation, is going to come from public resources. The third thing that I think is not so clear, and therefore it's worth discussing a bit, is that if you look at the nature of external official financing now, I'm not talking about private financing, but providing loans to many of these countries to finance these SDGs just won't add up, because it will very quickly run into problems of unmanageable, unsustainable debt. So the IMF recently did some work, and already some 40% of low-income countries are running up to debt levels, and I think Billy just made that point, where if you add on more loans for whatever purpose, in the near term, you're going to see some problems. So it has to be in the form of grants. And I think, therefore, we need to have a more nuanced conversation about the nature of official financing. And I would also say that we need to push back, not just on the volume of ODA, which I think, Vinny and Jeff and Billy have all said, but also on where it's being spent. So look at how much ODA is currently being spent on middle-income countries, and therefore, if you look at the share of ODA, particularly bilateral ODA, and I often find that some of the bilaterals who are loudest in arguing for multilaterals to spend their money on low-income countries, when you look at their own bilateral spending of those countries, you find that their own pattern of spending actually is very different. They're often using their grant money for middle-income countries. So we have to also push back, I think, on that point. And then the final point I want to make is that when you look at domestic resource mobilization, Billy said, maybe we can raise 4 or 5% of GDP over the next few years, and probably in many countries. I think today there's a potential to do that. I would also argue, by the way, that there's a potential to save 2 or 3% of GDP relatively quickly by looking at the expenditure side. I mean, there's an awful lot of waste and corruption in spending in a number of countries, and I think if you focus on that, you free up 3 or 4% of GDP. But let's say 5% of GDP by raising revenue. Now look at the fragile states, right? Half the poor people by 2030 will be living in fragile states. In fragile states, it's very hard to envisage that we're going to be able to quickly raise revenue in the institutional and political governance frameworks that are there. And so we have to think a bit harder about what is our strategy for making progress towards SDGs in fragile states. And in the other countries, there's a very interesting piece of work that's done by Nora Lustig, who's a professor at Tulane University, where she looks at, country by country, her team, at the distributional impact of government spending and taxation together. Because when you look at taxes, you can say, well, yes, poor people pay, but then they get more in government programs. Well, actually, if you look at it, you find that in a number of countries, poor countries, low-income countries, the poorest people are net payers into the system. Now, I think it's just crazy. Why do we have a system in which the bottom 20%, the people living below the basic poverty line, are actually paying money into the government net? Even taking account of what they're getting as programs, they're still net payers into the system. I think, we should aim to have an international norm that says that in no country should the poorest people be net payers into the system. And frankly, the IMF actually, which is doing interesting work, as part of its annual consultations, could look at the incidence of taxes in countries and come back and say, on balance, in the aggregate, is your spending and taxation helping poor people in your country, or are you actually taking money from them to finance the needs of the rest of the economy? I think that would be a terrific advance that would actually start putting a little bit the spotlight on those countries where a little bit of reshifting, and that means maybe also looking at the nature of taxes. It's very easy to impose VAT, right? I mean, it's a sort of preferred tax of all tax economists because it's for good reasons, but VAT is generally a little bit more aggressive than other kinds of taxes. You could tax land, you could tax incomes, as we've been talking about, you could tax corporate profits in ways that we're not doing. And I think we should make a commitment as an international community that we, as all countries should say, we're not going to tax on net. We're going to make sure our poorest people are not paying into the system, they're getting from it.
So usually when people hear about rising taxes, it's usually not met with much happiness. So I'd also like to bring in Jeffrey here to help us really understand the macroeconomic consequences that tend to accompany a significant hike that you have in public spending, specifically when it comes to scaling up public investment.
Well, first of all, if you actually look at the correlation of tax rates and happiness, it turns out to be positive in the rich countries, not negative, because the happiest countries in the world, objectively by self-report in the Gallup surveys each year, are the Scandinavian countries, which also have the highest tax collections as a share of GDP. And it's not a mystery because they have wonderful public services and they enjoy their lives. So the idea that taxes are some kind of detriment to well-being is an American fiction, not a true principle of economies in practice. I think there's raging agreement on this panel on many key points, but then we have to understand what's the difference of this raging agreement and the reality that we have in the world. Because the raging agreement is there are major fiscal challenges that cannot be met out of domestic revenues and cannot be met out of loans and cannot be met out of privatization. And then the question is, so what to do? And we should understand how strange it is the way our world is organized right now. It's understood within our countries that to have even a simulacrum, a rough appearance of civilization, you better be collecting at least 20% of GDP in revenues to have a health system and an education system and so forth. And in the rich countries, it better be 40% or more, so that you're paying for pensions and you're paying for rising costs of an aging population and so on. And yet when it comes to the international community, such as we call it, because that, by the way, is a misnomer, there is no community, we don't even reach 0.5% of GDP in international fiscal collection and distribution. The aid levels are 0.3 of 1% of GDP. And so it's not surprising that whole regions of the world are just massively left behind. In other words, we don't have a fiscal system at the global level that is anywhere close to the ideals and aims that are expressed in things like the Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Climate Agreement. And the truth is, of course, the most powerful rich country in the world is the greatest slacker in the world. As I said, the United States is at 0.17 of 1% of GDP in development aid. It's supposed to be at 0.7. Do the arithmetic. That's 0.5% of GDP shortfall of the US on a $20 trillion economy. Just the US alone is $100 billion less than basic decency and international standards would have it. That's why the kids are dying and are not in school, because we don't even have the minimum of that. Then we have this guy Trump saying come on, really, let's get real. First, he's saying we've got to cut aid further to make America great again. It makes America disastrous to create that kind of world. And then he completely trying to destroy the international system right now. Because as we speak, we're shedding trillions of dollars of wealth because of this man's trade wars. So we've actually got to get our grips together to understand we need a multilateral system that aims for the goals that we have said we want to achieve. And it would not be hard to do this. It's small amounts of the vast production each year that we're talking about, tiny fractions of 1% of the production of the rich countries, or 1% of the net worth of the billionaires, the 2,000 billionaires. That's $100 billion that could make a difference in this. So the question is whether we fake it, whether we let misanthropes run the show, or whether we make a system that has some basic decency to it. This is really our generation's question right now. And right now, we are not decent. We're not behaving by any normal standard of what these goals require. And by the way, the same is true on even survival on climate change, because we're running into climate disaster, and yet the rich countries can't even follow through on what they promised for the last 10 years, $100 billion a year, which is tiny, 1/10 of 1% of world output, for climate control. And so the point I'm making is that we should not be wringing our hands or saying, how could we ever do this, or this is so hard, or the poor countries have to make difficult choices. They don't have to make difficult choices. The rich countries have to behave with just a modest amount of decency, and then the world could actually function normally.
So talking about that willingness for richer countries, we know that in a recent blog co-written by IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde and Vitor Gasper, head of the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, they said that a boost to tax revenues in this range would put the SDGs within the reach for emerging market economies like Indonesia, but not be sufficient to help the world's poorest countries, which would continue to require support from international donors and the private sector. So really, for private countries, for poorer countries, why are we not seeing then this willingness to provide this sort of support?
You know, I want us to shift this away from being a question of poor countries needing help from rich countries. Let's get it right. Oxfam did a study. We issued our report in January this year. We calculated and found that 82% of all new wealth created last year, 82%, was captured by the 1% at the top. And the bottom half of humanity, 50% of humanity, 3.7 billion people, hardworking people, got nothing of the new wealth created last year. This is the economy we are in, that sucks from poor people and rewards a few at the top. So we need to understand that developing countries, poor countries, low-income countries such as Uganda have hard-working people paying their taxes. But a few at the top, including big companies, are sucking the wealth out of these countries. And that's what we must stop. So if we are talking about domestic revenues, we have to close all those loopholes that allow big companies to get away without paying their fair share of taxes. That would be a lot of money brought in. UNCTAD has calculated that developing countries lose $100 billion every year through just one of the loopholes of routing through tax havens. $100 billion a year. So if we could close that, that's money to developing countries. Then we did a study last year again in the US alone. We found that 50 biggest companies spend over $350 million lobbying Capitol Hill on tax issues. And they receive over $420 billion in tax breaks. Calculate that. Some of you here might know how to do maths. For every $1 spent on lobbying by those 50 companies, they collectively received $1,200 in tax breaks for every $1. Think of that as a return on investment. Huge. So we're talking about political capture. We're talking about rich companies sitting around the corridors of power and arguing and creating loopholes for themselves not to pay their fair share of taxes. So I want to insist that domestic revenues could be boosted if the rich pay their fair share. And that's why we support the campaign that Jeff has started. I think you call it human something?
Move Humanity.
Move Humanity, a tax on billionaires, asking them to pay just 1% of their billions, 1% only. It won't hurt them. It won't make them poor. But that 1% will result in billions that could go towards paying for the SDGs. And that's not charity. I'm not asking them to give philanthropy like Bill Gates gives and who gives. No, tax. Tax means paying your fair share, not giving away out of kindness. They should pay their fair share because they capture more out of the collective than other people do. So I'm arguing for more domestic resources through taxation of the rich. That's what Oxfam believes. And I'm also arguing for a global corporate tax reform that will plug the loopholes that are cheating the developing countries in particular.
Now, Bilal, we know that the SDG Center for Africa and the SDSN recently released its SDG Index report. Now, you describe it more as a tool. How so?
Yeah, this is our monitoring tool, basically. I think when we talk about SDGs, as you know, this is one great program with, maximum level of clarity on purpose, and also defined targets to be attained every year over 15 years. So in other words, the SDG is a unique opportunity that shows us how to plan from future to present rather than planning from present to the future as we used to. Because we have agreed where to meet exactly 15 years from now on health, on education, on agriculture. So if we know where to be 15 years from today, then we can backcast easily and find out where exactly we are 3 years, 2 years, 4 years plus 7 days from today. So that's what SDGs are. So I think we based on that and try to track where exactly countries are. So the first 2 years, it was a global kind of index. And then we found out on the third year that it is a bit difficult actually to exchange experiences in this when you compare 193 countries in one table, when we can compare, like, okay, we can still stay with 193, but also African countries with Africa, experiences, and then, because there are some unique indicators also and targets that Africa has to inculcate if it has to address some of the basic issues. So that exercise is, first, it's monitoring. We have to monitor, and we don't have to wait until we do evaluation and look for a big shoulder to cry on, like what we did during MDGs, which is not acceptable. We don't have time for that. Second, if you monitor, then that information should not be shelved. If it's monitored, it's a monitoring information, and then we ask countries to name one day in a year where that report will be discussed among partners, government being a center for this custodian, but partners are the ones who are actually implementing SDGs along with the government. So this report has to be discussed between government and all the actors together, and then decide how to catch up with the lost time and see how they can change gears and improve performances. So that is the main purpose of that report. And secondly, this report also help us now to to see the synergy between the Agenda 2063 of African Union, which is a 50 years time-bound agenda, but 85% of that agenda overlaps with the 2030 agenda. So we just want to show to the public as well as the people that these are not two different programs. If there is any difference, the difference is the time, the time target. One is 15 years, the other one is 50 years. One is global, the other one is more African. One has a big component of identity and move toward certain things. The other one in that 15% gap, and the other one is focusing on the global agendas, which Africa is also interested in part of it. The last important thing of this report, by the way, has three components. The first one is, the dashboard that shows where exactly each country is on each target of the SDGs, whether it's yellow, red, or green. So help them to understand where their position is. Secondly, it ranks countries. The ranking is like 51 countries involved in Africa this year, in 2018. And the ranking shows, North African countries perform well. Morocco is the first. And then the ranking goes also, sub-regional by sub-regional, and exactly which sub-region is doing well in what, and which sub-region is doing, bad in certain things. So it shows that kind of stuff. And the final part of the report is actually the analytical part of the report. That is important because we believe that the SDG is about the bottom 30–40% of the population. And such kind of report like indexes are only serving certain level of elites. Not everyone will understand what it is. So for the first time, we designed how to get this report translated into citizens' report, and goes all the way to the bottom 30–40% of Africans, particularly in the rural areas, who are not capable of reading and writing, develop some kind of translation on that, and help them to understand where their country stands so that they can demand more, put pressure in their governments from district level to the national level. So that's what that report is.
Now, as we know, 2030 is fast approaching for this target to achieve these goals. We know it's drawing closer. And I'd like to quote Edward Stanley, who wrote, "Those who think they have no time for exercise will sooner or later have to make time for illness." Time is ticking. Obviously, this is something that's going to need to be addressed, whether we like it or not. So if we could sum up in a sentence for all of you, starting with Masood, what would you say are the long-term consequences of not prioritizing SDG funding and supporting policies right now?
I think the first half sentence is to say, Jeff said that the Nordic countries were the happiest, or among the happiest. I think it's good to remember that the country we're sitting in, Indonesia, actually is in the top 10 in terms of people feeling happy. So clearly we've got a lot to learn from all of the people here. Now, I think if you say, well, what's the consequence? Look, over the next 2 decades, we're going to go through a demographic and economic transformation in Africa that is going to shape the future of the world for the next century. more young people are going to come onto the labor market in Africa over the next decade than has ever been the case in the history of the world. Not more than came on board in China when China was growing, more than came on board in India. And population of Africa is going to double and double again before the end of the century. So really, if there is a fundamental single development challenge that faces us, it is to ensure that we support the development of individuals and communities and societies in Africa in whatever way we can to give those young people the skills, the health, the education, and the opportunities that will make them vibrant and satisfied and equally happy as all the people are here in Indonesia. And, you know, just think about the consequences of not investing in that global endeavor. And that is why, to me, this is not about something that's, you know, elsewhere, it's in Africa, you know, and the rest of the world sort of sitting around. This is a global endeavor because that is part of a global community which, whether we like it or not, is going to be more and more and more interconnected. And that's why I believe that the answer for me to people who are saying, why should we bother? You know, this is sort of, as Jeff was saying, there's sort of, and I don't think it's, by the way, only in the US. And if you go around, talk to other, in Europe, I find also more and more there are people who are less committed to the consensus that existed before. I think we just need to make people realize that in this interconnected world, our futures are intertwined. And therefore, the cost of not investing in this is not investing in our own collective future. And to me, that's really the compelling argument as to why we have to get on with making the kinds of changes which may look a little bit, you know, you sort of think of them, well, is this going to happen? You know, think about what happens if it doesn't happen. Right. That's really my pick on it.
Now, unfortunately, we are a little tight on time, but I would like to open the floor up.
Could I just add one word?
One word.
One sentence. Right now, 25% of African kids are finishing upper secondary, and 75% are not. It's a disaster. And any country that is leaving kids without finishing at least secondary school right now is going to face disaster. This is the most basic reality. So if you can't get your kids healthy, properly fed, and through school, what are we doing? That's the minimum, and that we're not doing right now. Right. So that's really what this is about.
Absolutely.
And we'll probably be able to work some of your answers into some of the questions. Yes, in the front, if I could get a mic to this gentleman. If you could stand up, please, they can get a mic to you. And please let us know if it's directed at a particular panelist or to the panel as a whole.
Yes, thank you, Madam, for wonderful moderations. I think it's been a wonderful panel on the SDGs. I would also like to thank Professor Jeffrey Sachs for shouldering the burden of the world poor and for helping the billionaire to spend their money wisely. I think hopefully they will listen to...
I got lots of ideas.
They will listen to you a bit wisely. And I think when the MDG were considered, and they were actually accompanied with the HIPIC, the debt relief, to provide some fiscal space to country towards the implementations. And now we've moved into the SDGs with limited fiscal space for countries. And increasingly we now hear, as Mr. Masood Hamed said, the rising debt burden, debt distress in some countries, which pose even more challenges on the options of raising more resources domestically. And I think the billionaires are one option. But should we also consider, going back to the issue of tax, illicit financial flows, shaming the banks, which have actually allowed many Africans, millionaires, we siphon the money abroad. And we know the report of saying that Africa is actually a net creditor to the world with more than $2 trillion outside the continent. If we manage to bring part of that, it could serve as a major deterrent in optimal allocations of resources. Is that something we should explore? Let me hear from the panel. Thank you.
And who would like to start? Really?
Yeah, you mentioned illicit financial flows. They are a big problem. But actually, I think we should start by trying to rein in tax avoidance, not the tax evasion. The tax evasion, yes, it's big amounts, but I think what we lose even more is what is legally avoided. Let me give you an example of my country, Uganda. We struck oil. We're a very poor country. We've got a little oil that could help us. And we've struck contracts with some companies to come and extract tallow and Total. Tallow is an Irish company, actually, but it registered in the UK, so it's a British company because the British system and the laws there help it to make more profit. But do you know that it is registered to extract oil in Uganda as a Dutch company? It went and registered in the Netherlands in order to benefit from a Dutch treaty with Uganda to get tax exemptions. Total, French company, is also sitting in Uganda as a Dutch company. It also has a post office box in the Netherlands to enable it to benefit from a Dutch treaty that is going to give them tax benefits. So you see just a playing around with a corporate tax system that's not fit for purpose, that has been designed in every way to help these companies to rob, literally rob poor countries. So this is what we need to rein in. We need to reform the corporate tax system and close these glaring loopholes. They are legal. They're all legal. We need to close them so that they pay their fair share of taxes in these countries. And then, of course, there's the illegal stuff that we must chase and stop. But I would start by reforming the system.
There's very little difference of legal and illegal in this. The whole system is run with impunity. Rich companies do not get audited. Nobody gets audited. And by the way, all of the transactions are easily traceable. Everything goes through the SWIFT payment system. So it's not as if one should think about hidden ways that make the money untraceable. This is the system. And as Winnie is saying, think of these countries that play this game: the United States, the UK, Netherlands, Ireland, Singapore. These are the tax havens. And the system is rigged for this purpose. So, and it's designed by the richest people in the world to run this way. It's not beyond technical solution. By the way, the only point I would slightly disagree with is that there's so much rampant illegality also, which we see whenever the Panama Files or the Paradise Files are released, or we get a glimmer with Trump's tax returns, because the guy's a complete crook and the family. No, honestly, the guy is a complete crook. That's why he doesn't release the tax returns. And the New York Times exposed probably $500 million of tax evasion last week. And then when Manafort was sentenced, we saw, here's a guy that was heading the Republican Party, blah, blah, blah. And it's all thievery. It's all tax evasion. It's all dummy corporations. There's actually a hairdresser in Ukraine that discovered he was the CEO of a company he didn't know about because they had stolen his identity so Mr. Manafort could launder his millions of dollars. These people are crooks. They happen to be running my country right now. But don't be jealous. You've got crooks running your countries too.
Belay, would you like that?
Yeah, no, I mean, even after saying all this, I think it's important to see how we can get return, resource, money that has been fled from Africa on an eliciting way. I mean, this is the next campaign. Absolutely, it is an important idea. How to do it, and who would cooperate on this, and the fight would be a new front for, actually bringing challenge on us or divert attention. That's a detail. But this is absolutely something that we need to think of. But having said this, please give me half a second on this. I think it's also good to see whether the existing financial orders, arrangements, be it in multilateral or any, right now is working for poor in Africa. I mean, it's extremely important. Look, we've been trying to push with technologies, interventions, whether it's irrigation or in agriculture, anything like that. And we have fantastic ideas, technologies, innovations. But scaling is becoming a big issue because no resource available to that level, to that kind of poor farmers, that would serve that kind of interest at all. So we are frustrated on this stuff. And there are, global level funds for education, health, whatever. And we believe those funds are funds that are serving these causes that we are putting, that Africa is struggling on. And these funds have to be managed, lead, and if there is any way of replenishing, if there is any way of supporting, it should be really something that is driven where the challenge and where the battlefield is. Right. So the current financial order and support and all these things, we really need to revisit if we genuinely want to push this agenda of SDGs in Africa. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much. We're out of time for questions. I'd like to give a big thank you to our wonderful panel here today, Jeffrey Sachs, Winnie Byanyima, Belay Bargashore, and Masood Ahmed. Thank you so much, and thank you as well for joining us.
Thank you.
You guys were wonderful.